Well, good morning, and thank you so much for tuning in here to Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Ryan Kalesuji, joined by Yanji Denise. And of course, this is a program where we like to spotlight some of the issues and topics that are making headlines here in the state of Hawaii. And today we're going to be shifting gears away from COVID-19. Of course, that has been a topic and conversation that has dominated much of our discussion over the past year. But there certainly are other things that are happening in the state. And today's topic surrounds the legalization of marijuana, Yanji.
Yeah, that's right, Ryan. I mean, there have been a lot of discussions about this over the year, and it is again front and center at the state legislature, lawmakers looking at a bill that would legalize marijuana. So we want to bring in State Senator Chris Lee, who is one of the folks that is pushing this proposal, along with Gregory Tjapkes, who is the executive director of Coalition for Drug-Free Hawaii. Of course, these two gentlemen have opposing views on this topic, but this is not your formal debate. This is really a discussion where we can dive into the issues around this proposal and also get questions from you in the audience. What do you want to know about the push to legalize marijuana here in the state? Let's start off with you, Senator Lee. Thank you so much for being here today. You know, Hawaii a few years back passed a measure that decriminalized a small amount of marijuana, bumping it down to a fine. Can you just give people a lay of the land as to what's legal right now and what you're advocating for?
Sure, and thanks for having me. And to your point, I think actually Gregory and I actually agree on a lot of this discussion, because we all want to see better outcomes, which is the end of the day, whether the law legalizes something or doesn't. The question is, how do we get to this better place? And so right now in Hawaii, we have a situation where for many years, decades, cannabis has been illegal generally. The legislature took some action years ago to try and set up a medical marijuana program, which took many years to get off the ground. And finally, only a few years ago, it really got going. So right now, cannabis can be used for medical purposes with essentially a doctor's note and a card for that. But also last year or 2 years ago now, we changed the law to decriminalize cannabis. And what that means is it's not legal. It's still illegal unless you're part of that medical program. But instead of the traditional catching someone with it and then sending them to jail, slapping or throwing the book at them and slapping them with a bunch of fines and jail time, this takes a step that other countries and states and basically anyone who's looked at the data thinks is a better way forward. So instead of going to jail, you can fine people and basically give them a traffic ticket. And what this does, and the intent was to stop demonizing people, giving them a criminal record that ultimately destroys their job prospects, their ability to get education grants, and basically function in life in a case where we want people to better themselves and improve themselves. So this would basically provide a better legal pathway forward for people that isn't going to just add people to our jail system and not solve the problem of drug dependence or whatever else might be the root cause of their problem.
Greg, we want to bring you in here to start off this conversation. What are your thoughts moving at, and as you represent this coalition, your thoughts on this push to legalize marijuana here in the state?
Thank you for having me, first of all. I think a move slow approach and a science-based approach is probably the best way to go. And I do agree with Senator Lee that. And actually, if you look at what the scientists and the medical experts say is, some form of decriminalization is a proper, and the right form of decriminalization is a proper thing to do to make sure that we take care of, social justice issues, lots of times impacting minority groups, et cetera. My organization works mostly really with youth and families, and we're just trying to help create a good environment for them to learn, succeed in life, graduate from school, et cetera. And if you look at what substances hang up adolescents, it's alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana by far. And the greater that these are prevalent and available in society, the more use there is. It's just simply that way. If you look at kind of what's happened with vaping, right? It's just kind of overtaken us. And we know about 10% of the kids that are vaping some sort of THC product too. So we really want to protect the kids. And we know that if you're a child, I mean, the science shows again that if you're a child of someone who smokes or even smoked marijuana in the past, you're 2.5 to 4 times more likely to smoke yourselves. And then if we got kids doing that, they're not succeeding in school the way they could be.
Senator Lee, let's talk about the details of the proposal specifically. Right now, since a small amount already has been decriminalized, why is that not enough? What would you actually like to see happen?
So, and let me return to one point real quick, because I know we keep throwing around the term marijuana, but one of the things that we had a great debate on here at the state capitol and around the country is sort of trying to identify what this actually is, right? I mean, the real term is cannabis. And this goes back to part of the reason why I think our laws are the way they are and why we're trying to change them. Because going back to the 20s to the 60s, really, as drugs were criminalized throughout the United States, I mean, a lot of it was tied into racism, to ability to try and demonize certain populations and minorities by associating them with certain things. And marijuana in particular was one of these key targets. And there's a guy, I forget his name, I think his last name was Anslinger. He was the federal commissioner who led the prohibition effort for the feds for about almost 40 years through multiple presidencies. And he basically said that there's a handful of folks in the U.S. that use marijuana and try to tie it in with something that sounds foreign. And they're, Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and it's going to cause them with their satanic music and jazz and swing and all this other stuff. And these crazy quotes that today, have nothing to do with what we're talking about, was used to sort of demonize. And that's sort of the history of this. So we actually changed the law to change the term to cannabis, because what we're really talking about is just a natural plant and a remedy. We want to disassociate ourselves with, I think, the past of all of that, going even through, the Nixon presidency, trying to demonize hippies and tie it to that. And so when we talk about this, these laws that we're trying to change now are a relic of that era and a relic of trying to control a population and take away some of that freedom. And unlike alcohol and tobacco, which are perfectly legal today, it really comes down to responsible use and how do you set up laws so that people are free to responsibly live their lives, especially if there's something that can help them. And in this case, clearly cannabis can have a positive effect for some people when used in moderation. So what we'd like to see, going back to your question, right now the law is up to 3 grams of cannabis can get you a ticket essentially and is illegal. Any more than that and you're still going to jail. But ultimately, I think in the long run, as we're seeing states around the country legalize completely, we're looking for setting up a framework so that we can have a responsible market set up that is well regulated and addresses, I think, a lot of the concerns that were raised about underage use and all the other potential ills that come from it, but give us all the benefits too. And I think that's where we're targeting. How do we set that up so it fits Hawaii so we can have the best outcome?
As a follow-up to that, Senator, if you can update us on the actual legislation that is currently in the state legislature this year and where we're at with that.
Sure. So there were a couple bills introduced this year. I put 2 of them in. One created a legalized framework for cannabis. The second one decriminalized further to about an ounce of cannabis. So you'd still get a ticket for having that much, but fewer people would be going to jail. And that's about average across the country. Roughly an ounce is what's decriminalized now in the 13 states that have decriminalized. Obviously, the 17 other states that have fully legalized, you can have much more than that depending on the state. But generally, that's the gist of the 2 bills. So they were heard in their hearings. The Senate passed both of those bills to the House. Unfortunately, it didn't get a hearing in the House. But I will say, it's encouraging because this is the furthest that any legislation has ever got in Hawaii to this end. And at a time when almost half the US population lives in states where cannabis is fully legalized and where the overwhelming support of the general population out there continues to grow, it seems like it's inevitable. So the question is, how do we do it right?
Greg, I want to bring in this question from Ingrid Peterson. You brought up youth that you work with. She says, I recently worked in middle and high schools for 16 years. Students who want cannabis can already get it easily. Legalization would mean we'd know what was in the marijuana and be able to tax it. What's your take on that?
I don't know that legalization would mean we would know, what's in it necessarily, because there's still going to be, any legal state right now probably has a really thriving black market. Secondly, when we talk about marijuana, and everyone thinks, well, it's a plant, it's natural, it should be legal. Up until about 20 years ago or so, it was fairly natural and had about a 5% THC, maybe 10% THC content. What we're talking about now is really legalizing THC, not legalizing the plant of marijuana, because even when Colorado legalized it, it had maybe 10% THC product was there, and now most of it is high THC content. 70% of the sales are high THC content derivatives. It's not stuff that you would see in a joint wrapped up and smoked. It's something that's going to be dabbed, vaporized, and it's seriously concerning. And I think the more that we bring product like that into Hawaii or anywhere in the market, the more trouble we're going to see. Not just with youth, but with impaired driving deaths, et cetera. And they've seen that across the nation already.
Yeah, I want to, Greg, if I can follow up on that, as we discuss this conversation, not only here locally, but we're seeing what's happening on the mainland with other states moving forward and to this degree legalizing it. What have you seen from what other states have done that concern you maybe, or that could, raises a few red flags on your end? Because obviously the conversation has to be had for your coalition and the work you folks do on a national level as well. What are you learning from the other states?
Well, I think some of it is kind of a Pandora's box sort of thing, where they're, like I mentioned, the impaired driving, but with youth use, I think cannabis use disorder, which is a fancy term for addiction, has increased 25% among youth in legalized states. And right now, for instance, the state pays for about 1,700 kids to receive some sort of substance abuse treatment. That's in Hawaii here. Over 60 to 65% is for cannabis use disorder. So we already have plenty of that going around. The estimated need is over 5,000, youth a year. So we're not addressing the need we have already, and we're talking about introducing another, impairing addictive substance into the community. And I think, Colorado's looking at limiting THC now, because it wasn't a thing like it is now. And so they're looking at limiting THC use. California is looking at lowering the taxes because black market weed is just more affordable than the legal weed. So I think there's just a lot of issues going on out there. But if I think the primary thing is, it is a drug, right? It's legalized, it's medical marijuana, it's a drug. And I think the first question should be, is it safe? Is it good for our community? How's this going to help our community, just kind of on the health and wellness? And if you look at what the doctors say, the pediatricians are against it, the American Medical Association's against it, American Academy of Psychiatric or American Society of Addiction Medicine, they're against it. Most of medical groups are not for it at all. So I think if we answer the health question first, then we move on to, can we make it safe, and can we make money doing this?
Well, let's talk about that, Senator. Are there ways to put guardrails to prevent some of what Greg's talking about?
Absolutely. And I think this is exactly the concerns Greg talks about, in many cases are totally real, but I think it's exactly the reason why we want to create a legalized, regulated framework that properly puts those guardrails in place. So the product that we're creating, just as society generally, kind of cannabis products that are out there are safe, are regulated, are monitored, because right now we know it's already out there. I mean, you can get stuff off the street pretty much anywhere. Anybody who's in high school, college, anywhere, older adults. I mean, I'm going to tell this story for maybe the first time publicly, but before the medical marijuana program stood up, my sister has, who grew up here with me, has MS and was diagnosed with that. And for years, my mom ended up being her dealer illegally, because for a long time, the medication that she had to pay were hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs, or she could just do this. And the stuff that they were getting, came from unknown sources, and there's a real question there. And today, still, you can get that. That black market exists in Hawaii, and it's available. Pretty much everybody knows this is a real thing. So the question is, we can't just ignore that, right? We can't make policy for an ideal world and pretend everything's utopian. And so what we have to do is create policy to address this reality. And if we want to learn from the other states, one of the big lessons that we have learned is, generally speaking, in states that have created legalized frameworks for proper regulation, underage use has declined in many cases. And you've been able to address some of those concerns about where stuff's coming from. And this is a real concern here in Hawaii, because on the windward side, not too long ago, we did have a young adult who unfortunately got something that was apparently laced with all kinds of other stuff that is just way more dangerous, and ended up losing their life. And this kind of thing doesn't have to be this way. And we know that there are steps we can take to address many cases like this. And I think that's what we're trying to get at, is how do we create a safe, regulated market that protects everybody to the extent that we can.
Senator, a few years ago, the state moved forward and did allow for the use of medical marijuana and setting up those facilities. We know that that was a pretty lengthy process that had to get going to organize what that looked like. There was a few hiccups over the time. With something like you're describing, are you concerned at just the logistics of it, how that would be implemented and executed, knowing what we saw with medical marijuana and all the steps that would have to be taken to figure out what department would oversee this on the state level, the resources that they would have to get? I mean, logistically, there's a lot that would have to be implemented, I'm assuming.
Sure. So I think the great thing is, there's a lot of other places that have already done this, and they've been doing it in some cases longer than a decade. And so there's a lot of good models to look at to see what worked, what didn't. We know that in Hawaii, we are obviously a little bit different, but we also have some real benefit where we are isolated, right? We're an island chain. We're not going to get a lot of stuff pouring over state lines, but we can't create an export market for that. But I think that's where a lot of the regulation is going to come into play. We want to keep and maintain, I think everybody generally agrees, the sort of medical grade setup we have for our medical program, because it ensures a higher level of quality and other considerations for those purposes. But generally, the rest of it, I think, is more about a question of who's allowed to produce and what are those requirements going to be. I think the departments themselves have been hesitant up until now because of we just haven't gone down that road yet, but we clearly have done it a number of times with other products in many cases. And this is one of those opportunities where, we talk about diversifying our economy over and over, and especially now coming out of COVID. And in other states that have done this, that have set it up right through their departments and have the state involved, they're creating tens of thousands of jobs, about 70,000 jobs across the country just in 2020 alone, even during the pandemic. And that's something that we can use here in a way that gives us a huge local benefit, and the resources from that can go back into those state departments and back to the community to treat things like other drug dependencies and rehabilitation, and give us a lot of opportunity that otherwise doesn't exist.
To that point, Teddy Cam says, economic opportunity, diversify away from tourism. Greg, what about the economic benefit to the state? What about that argument? Because it is compelling. Some states are doing rather well in this industry.
I think, again, you have to weigh your harms versus your benefits. Lots of times we look at the tax revenues in those states, and we get very anxious about we're missing out on these things. But, we have to look at who we are as a state, what we value, the experience of being in Hawaii, living here. There are many things we can make money off of, expanding our B&Bs in Kailua. We could legalize gambling and increase tax revenues, prostitution. It could be any number of things that we could do to increase tax revenues. And I just, think to myself, I see the harms to kids, to youth, and some of the harms that we're just kind of getting a hold of right now because of the new higher THC content, where it's increased psychosis, etc. And I'm thinking, is this really the best we can do to sell drugs to balance the books? Just because we know gambling occurs and people can go out and gamble, so there's a black market for gambling. Do we say, well, since there's a black market for gambling, let's make it legal and let's go ahead and make some money off of that deal? So I don't buy that argument.
I disagree just a little bit, and I think it's a good analogy made with gambling and some other stuff. Airbnbs and Kailua is a great one, but I think the truth here is you can have a win-win in this case where you're not compromising, because we know already that a lot of those impacts in our community, like the teen who unfortunately lost their life because they got unsafe product. And if we want to reduce underage use and provide resources to deal with actual treatment and not just criminalize something or pretend like it's not going to be an issue that we can't address properly, I think this is an opportunity to do both. We can create that framework that limits THC, that puts a product out there that we know will be safer, and at the same time use that revenue for things like public schools and safer roads and all the rest of it. So I feel like it's not necessarily one or the other, but it can be both. And I think a lot of states that have done this have seen positive benefit on both sides.
Earlier in this broadcast, Senator, you spoke about where we're at with this current legislation that you introduced and it being stalled in the House. So, there clearly is still debate that has to be happening and conversations that you're trying to have with your counterparts to encourage them to move this forward. The governor who also said on this program a few months back that this wasn't something that he would have, he supports. He believes that it should be done on the federal level. So there are some obstacles in having to overcome in order to get people to buy into what you're trying to promote here and what you would like to advance. If you can speak to what you're trying to do or those types of conversations to maybe get some of your colleagues to be more open to this idea.
Sure. When we originally started these conversations at the state level, like many years ago, it wasn't something that got a lot of traction. There wasn't a lot of discussion, but I think today that's rapidly changing, and there's a lot more education going on. I mean, the bill overwhelmingly passed the Senate with only a handful of no votes, and I would think that tracks public support. And it's not really me so much pushing this. I think there's generations of people realizing that, hey, this isn't a big deal. This isn't the end of the world. The sky's not going to fall. It's already out there. And other places are doing it right in many cases. So what can we learn from that and do it ourselves? And if you look, nationally, like the polling has trended so quickly in towards support. I mean, today, I think it's about 70% nationally. The last report I saw, the last poll just a couple months ago, in support. We've polled our district here in Hawaii. I pulled my district, and some of our colleagues have, and the numbers I'm seeing are about the same, roughly a little bit higher, about 72 to 73% for our area. And I think that's something that makes this an inevitable conversation. So the question isn't so much how do we get that conversation going? It's already going. The question is how do we, I think, craft something that makes sense, that puts the right guardrails on things that will give us ultimately the better outcome all around. And so that's sort of the stage we're entering into, where this is now a reality and a political reality that is very possible here in Hawaii for the first time, perhaps ever. And the question is now we got to get all the voices at the table, groups far and wide, like Greg's and others. And I served on the board of the Meth Project for a number of years and have a lot of experience, I think, with sort of this, we want something, we want to prohibit it completely. Black market is created, and there's all kinds of other problems. Prohibition didn't work. We want to get past that. We want to have real policy and a real debate around that. And I think that's exactly where we're at now.
Greg, if this is, as the senator is saying, basically an inevitability, is there a path forward that you can see where there would be some form of legalization while still preventing some of the outcomes that you were talking about?
Well, I don't see it as an inevitability. I'm from Michigan. I'm a Detroit Lions fan, and so I'm used to being an underdog. But I would say this: if you look at just first refer to the science, and I think that's what a lot of people have been saying about COVID. Let's just follow the science, and I think we refer to the science, refer to the doctors and what they say, public safety officials, et cetera. That's going to help us get further down the road. I haven't seen the legislation, the bills change that much over the years. They don't change with what's happening in regard to kind of the science that's happening right now in the research. The Association, American Society of Addiction Medicine, the president is Dr. Bill Hanning from JAPSM. He's an addiction psychiatrist. He's essentially our local Dr. Fauci for these issues. And they have a extremely robust policy statement that regular lay people like me can read that says, you know, we're really not for it, but if you were to do it, these are the things you should do. They lay out all these things, all these guidelines, etc. If there was legislation that had that kind of detail in there, that would probably be the safest and smartest path forward. That's just what I would say.
You know, our time here is already up. This conversation on time definitely flew by with this topic. Greg, I do want to give you an opportunity to have any final thoughts on this as we wrap things up, and any final words that you might have about this issue.
Well, I'll just say, you know, again, we're there to try and protect the youth. My organization is, and in conditions that increase youth use, our access, you know, normalization and perception of harm, and the perception of harm of marijuana has decreased over the past few years as we're starting to see it as, you know, medicine. We think it's medicine now, and more youth are trying, youth meaning adolescents, are trying, you know, marijuana for the first time than they are cigarettes, because we did such a good job with, you know, public health statements on cigarettes and tobacco and the harms. And so I would just say, you know, just making something legal is not going to necessarily, you know, decrease use or make sure we have a, you know, better handle on it. We have issues with opioids. We have issues with vaping. We're trying to reduce drunk driving. We're, you know, the tobacco fund, you know, is led by because of its situation with big tobacco. Big tobacco is behind marijuana legalization, make no doubt about it. And they're the ones who stand to gain the most on this.
And Senator, will also allow you the opportunity. Obviously, you are passionate about this. This is something that you would like to see done. Your thoughts for anyone that may be watching out there today?
Sure. You know, I think this is an opportunity, and I agree with Greg. I think, you know, we can do things differently to protect youth, to protect, I think, those who need help, and better regulate a market and create a safer product here, which is already here and already dangerous in many cases. So I think if we're for freedom and responsibility and making sure that we do things right for people, we can create a legal framework that allows folks to do that while reducing underage use, which has been the experience of all the states that have already legalized, because they're able to put guardrails on it, create a safer product, make sure that it's accessible only to some folks. And you're not going to solve every problem, but it'll go a long way. And we've seen overall benefit, I think. And that's something that will create a safer, regulated Hawaii when it comes to this kind of thing. On top of that, of course, you know, the budget hat side of me and our legislative responsibilities can also say we can take that revenue and put it back into our local economy, back into better schools, better treatment for other drug issues. There's all kinds of stuff we can do. And I'll wrap it up by just saying, you know, Colorado had got about $1.6 billion in revenue for the time that it's been legalized. We could build 16 public schools with that kind of revenue, to say nothing of the kind of support that we want to fight big tobacco, to fight these criminal interests and others that are trying to ultimately profit by hurting people. But I think we have to do it in a smart way, and creating a legalized framework that allows us to make those decisions and doesn't let other people do an end run with their black market products is the way to do it.
Okay, well, State Senator Chris Lee and Gregory Tjapkes from the Coalition for Drug-Free Hawaii, thank you both so much for being here today and sharing your passions on this topic that gets a lot of passion from our audience as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, very interesting to hear both sides on that. And, you know, as the senator mentioned, the bill that he is pushing got the furthest it has gotten ever in the legislature. So this is a conversation that continues to be ongoing. We've seen, you know, just in the last few weeks, New York and I believe it's Mississippi had just legalized marijuana. And so we continue to see, you know, a hodgepodge of states here and there. But, you know, part of the reason the governor, when he was on, said that he did not support this is that it is still illegal on the federal level. And so with the states sort of making their own rules, it does create, a dilemma for the states.
And then no doubt is an issue that continues to have a very passionate opinions on both sides. And we're seeing it in our comment sections as well, with some of you advocating for this and some who are against it. And it really is something that continues to be a hot topic in the community, and something that lawmakers will have to address in how they move forward. You know, there are those who believe in this issue and that want to see this passed, but no doubt there are others in the legislature that maybe are a little less are a little more weary about doing something like this. And so, as we know right now, with this current legislation, it currently is stalled in the House and not looking like it will advance in this session. But as the senator says, he believes this is inevitable, that this is something that is happening, that is gaining momentum and traction over the time. And it's not a matter of if, but when at this point.
Yeah, so we appreciate both of them being on. We appreciate all of you for being here as well. We're going to be back here on Friday with Anne Pereira-Eustaquio from the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations. She, of course, is going to talk about unemployment benefits. We know a lot of you have been having some issues with getting through that system. They have now set up a system for online appointments, so we're going to be talking to her about that. They are limited, but how do you get one and what can you resolve in that? You know, in those appointments, we're going to be talking to her about all of that. Ryan, she's always a very popular guest.
Yeah, no doubt. She will have a lot of updates for us as they continue to also fight through fraud and some of the issues that they're having there as well. So looking forward to that conversation. And then next week, we'll be starting off another week with the governor to get an update on all the things that are happening here in the state, including, of course, the vaccination passport, if you will, or this vaccination card that will allow travel to potentially happen between neighbor islands that many are hoping will begin on May 1st. We talked to the lieutenant governor about that issue, so we'll be sure to follow up with the governor. Again, this is next week, Monday. We'll be having that conversation with him. But until then, we look forward to seeing all of you right back here on Friday at 10:30 here for another edition of Spotlight Hawaii. Aloha.
Aloha.